Order, order. I call Matt Chorley and Patrick Maguire.
I'll tell you what, Patrick, your jingle gets more and more elaborate. You've now got cheering and clapping. Clapping, which isn't really even allowed in the House of Commons.
I know. Lindsay Hall will not take kindly to that if he's listening, which I very much hope he isn't.
He should be in the Commons chamber. So Patrick Maguire's here, Times Red Box editor. If you've only recently joined us here on Times Radio, welcome aboard. Welcome to the Fun Factory. What we do with PMQs is rather than just putting it on and letting you work out what's going on, we pause the action live as we go along to try and explain what's happening between Keir Starmer and Boris Johnson. Interestingly, so two bits of breaking news here. I was about to point out that lots of Tory MPs are wearing face masks on the front bench. Rishi Sunak is wearing a face mask behind Boris Johnson, as is, I think, Dominic Raab. But Sky News are reporting that Keir Starmer has tested positive for COVID.
And I was just about to say it would make sense for Keir Starmer to ask about COVID this week because, this is a watershed budget for Rishi Sunak. He's all about optimism and talking about this being a transition from the pandemic age to a sort of more normal period of government activity. And in, an act of heavy-handed symbolism, the news gods have intervened and Keir Starmer can't ask about COVID because presumably he's now back in Kentish Town self-isolating.
Well, we are very much by the seat of our pants here because we don't actually know. Does that mean that Keir Starmer is going to ask the questions via Zoom, or is someone else being drafted in? You can see on the front bench, Dominic Raab is wearing a mask. Sitting next to him, Jacob Rees-Mogg isn't, because, of course, they've got convivial fraternal spirit. Which
Ed Miliband is asking the question.
Wowzers. Ed Miliband is going to stand in for Keir Starmer at PMQ, so not even Angela Rayner.
I am.
The deputy leader of the Labour Party.
There will be a lot of shadow cabinet ministers who aren't Ed Miliband's biggest fans, unamused by that.
And there has been lots of concern from the shadow cabinet that he was getting a bit above his station, Ed Miliband.
Presumably Ed Miliband is now about to ask him why he won't nationalise the energy providers. He looks to be having a good time anyway. This
is a very retro, old school PMQs. Certainly this is much more interesting than it would be normally because pre-budget PMQs is normally a slight waste of time. Right, we go live to the House of Commons for PMQs Unpacked. First question from Ed Miliband.
So I'm calling Ed Miliband to ask the question on behalf of the opposition. Ed Miliband.
Thank you. Just like the old days.
Just to say, I presume you all want to get onto the budget because all you're doing is delaying it. Ed Miliband.
He hasn't actually managed to say anything yet.
I just want to reassure both sides of the House it's one time only that I'm back. Mr. Speaker, we all need the vital COP26 summit in Glasgow to deliver next week, because failing to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees will have devastating consequences for our planet, and that is shared across this House. Does the Prime Minister agree that to keep that goal of 1.5 degrees alive, we need to roughly halve global emissions in this decisive decade?
Well, I welcome the right honourable gentleman to his place, and indeed, I think the whole House will extend our sympathies to the leader of the opposition. I hope he returns soon. It is, of course, correct, Mr. Speaker, that COP26 is both unbelievably important for our planet, but also very difficult, and it's in the balance. Mr. Speaker, and he's right in what he says about the need to keep 1.5 degrees alive, and that will be, and it does depend on what happens this decade. It depends on the commitments that are made. All I will say, Mr. Speaker, is that already very substantial commitments under the UK presidency designate of COP have been achieved, and we've moved from only 30% of the global economy committed to a net zero by the middle of the century to now 80%. And every day as I talk to international leaders, we hear further commitments to make those solid commitments that the world will need. Whether it is enough, Mr. Speaker, I'm afraid it is too early to say.
Ed Miliband.
OK, let's just pause it there. Ed Miliband very much going on home turf, if you like, former Energy and Climate Change Secretary, obviously, in the last Labour government.
Yeah, it's not his first rodeo. He was in Copenhagen when they got a climate deal over the line in 2009, I think it was. Interesting to hear Boris Johnson continuing to temper expectations about just what we can expect in Glasgow over the next few weeks. Obviously, we've had the Queen this morning pulling out, which may have more to do with her health than the chances of an agreement. But it's unusual for a prime minister to be so downbeat about a summit.
Do you think there's a little bit of expectation management?
I think so. I don't think anyone in government I speak to thinks it's going to be a failure. I think they are very concerned they want to roll the pitch for the chance of an agreement that falls short of a hugely ambitious sort of thing.
Because the two notable things this morning was Australia, are riven by basically they fight the culture war over climate change. The whole issue has forced out several prime ministers. They've just adopted a target of net zero carbon emissions by 2050. It followed quite a lot of wrangling between Scott Morrison, who's the prime minister, and Barnaby Joyce, who's his deputy, who leads the National Party, which is always opposed to all this. So that's quite a big shift. Australia's been a sort of big problem with this. The other thing that I noticed today was there was a report out from the UN that said that the net zero targets announced by 50 countries so far offer hope that the worst impacts of climate change could still be avoided. So it still feels like it's possible.
Yes, exactly.
Keeping hope alive is probably the best thing that we can.
And while the theatre, the Queen won't be there, Xi Jinping won't be there, Vladimir Putin won't be there. While the theatre might not be up to much, I think, as you say, a lot of the groundwork is happening already.
Okay, let's go back then. Here's question number 2. Ed Miliband standing in for Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I applaud the efforts of the UK presidency under the President-designate Starmer, but I do want to direct the Prime Minister's attention to the issue of this decade. I'll come to net zero targets for the middle of the century in a moment, but yesterday a very important report came out from the United Nations, which he will know, the UNEP Emissions Gap report. And on the eve of COP, it warned that far from halving global emissions this decade, we're only on course to reduce them by about 7.5%. Does the Prime Minister acknowledge, because this is crucial for what happens at Glasgow and after Glasgow, does the Prime Minister acknowledge how far away we are from the action required in this 10-year period?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, indeed I do, but I think what the House should also recognise is how far we have moved just in the space of a few years since the Paris COP summit of 2015, where, as I'm sure the right honourable gentleman will remember, the world agreed to net zero by 2100, by the end of the century, and agreed to try to restrain global warming by 4 degrees. We're now trying to keep alive the prospect of restricting that growth to 1.5 degrees. Every day, Mr. Speaker, countries are coming through with solid commitments on stopping the output of coal-fired power stations, reducing their use on internal combustion engines, planting millions of trees and investing hundreds of billions of pounds in the developing world. Those are solid commitments. Whether they're going to be enough, Mr. Speaker, I'm afraid it is still too early to say.
Okay, well, let's pause it there. It's interesting. Boris Johnson sort of agreed with Ed Miliband's assessment that what happens over the next 10 years is going to be crucial. It's not yet clear that enough will happen over the next 10 years.
Yeah, and it's a strange one, isn't it? Because obviously, us Westminster journalists will look at COP primarily almost as a test of Boris Johnson's, diplomatic acumen, his ability to get people around a table and agree a deal. But really, I think what he was saying there was absolutely fair, that he is not really the author of what's going to happen over the next 10 years, right? It's all about whether, the likes of your Russias, your Chinas, your Americas make those decisions. And what he can do or say is limited. So it's quite interesting. It's the one subject he's not particularly boosterish on, climate.
Yeah, and actually, and also there's always that tension as well with his own backbenchers, some of whom are slightly less persuaded of this.
And he doesn't, exactly. He doesn't want to sound too gung-ho about net zero because it's the area of acute weakness for him on the backbench, as you say. Exactly the same people who were making Theresa May's life misery over Brexit are now harrying Boris Johnson over net zero. Okay,
let's go back and see if Ed Miliband, standing in for Keir Starmer in PMQs. It's PMQs Unpacked, where we pause the action live in the House of Commons. Let's go back to question number 3.
For the commitments, I just correct the Prime Minister on one point. It was the second half of this century set out in Paris, not 2100 for net zero. But here's the problem, Prime Minister, on this question of net zero targets for the middle of the century. It's easy to make promises for 30 years' time. It's much more difficult to act now. Australia has recently announced a 2050 net zero target, but its 2030 target would head the world towards approximately 4 degrees of global warming. Can I urge him? He mustn't shift the goalposts when it comes to Glasgow. It is about the emergency we face this decade. It's about the NDCs this decade. Please keep the focus on 2030, not 2050 and beyond.
The focus is certainly on 2030. We have 122 nationally determined contributions already. 17 out of 20 G20 countries have made NDCs, and the commitments are coming through. And he's right to say that we need to keep the pressure up. What you can't do, Mr. Speaker, is go in advance of what is truly practicable for the world economy and for what people can do. This government will go as fast as we possibly can, but it was Labour's plans, which I think he endorsed, were condemned by the GMB union for which their paymasters, Mr. Speaker. For meaning that they'd be confiscating people's cars by 2030, and families would be only allowed one airplane flight every 5 years, Mr. Speaker.
Miliband.
Is that right, Patrick? This is what the GMB have suggested?
Well, it's interesting. I was actually going to point out, before Boris Johnson took the name of the GMB in vain, that this is quite a fraught. The politics of this for Labour are quite fraught as well, because in it's interesting how Miliband is talking about 2030. At Labour's Commons in 2019, there was a huge internal Barney over a motion that the grassroots wanted to pass saying net zero by 2035. And it was the unions who basically watered it down, changed all the language, stripped out all the concrete commitments, precisely because they were worried about the same things that Tory backbenchers were worried about, i.e., jobs, traditional industries, household budgets. So it's quite interesting to hear Boris Johnson cast the unions as, muesli munching hippies, when actually
the opposite has been
the case with the Labour Party.
Protecting sort of heavy industry has been a priority. Right, question number 4, Ed Miliband.
Mr. Speaker, let me tell him what this summit needs is statesmanship, not partisanship, which we just heard from the Prime Minister. He should not be trying to score party political points on such an important issue facing our country and our world. That's never the way I did PMQs. Now let me ask him. Let me ask him about the crucial issue of climate finance for developing countries, because the reason that the Paris summit succeeded was there was a coalition of vulnerable countries and developed countries that put pressure on all the big emitters, including China, including India. But the problem is that the world has not delivered on the $100 billion of finance promised more than a decade ago in Copenhagen. That the plan is to deliver it maybe in 2023. But I want to ask him about his actions. Hasn't it made it much harder to deliver on this promise that we are the only G7 country to cut the aid budget in the run-up to this crucial summit?
Mr. Speaker, I thought we weren't going to have any partisan points. Didn't last long. Actually, the first thing I did, one of the first things I did as Prime Minister was to go out to my first UNGA as Prime Minister's UN General Assembly as Prime Minister and announce a huge £11.6 billion commitment from the UK to helping the developed world to tackle climate change. And I'm going to say to the right honourable, yes, of course it's true, and we haven't cut that. We have not cut that, Mr. Speaker. We're keeping that investment. And let me tell the right honourable gentleman that this country is working flat out to ensure that we do reach the £100 billion commitment from the whole of the world. We're seeing the money come in from the United States, from the Italians, from the French, from the European Union, and it's quite right that it should. We have a way to go, Mr. Speaker. Whether we'll get there or not, I cannot say. It's in the balance. But the challenge is there for the leaders of the developed world, and I quite agree with the right honourable gentleman. They need to rise to it.
They both seem like they're enjoying this.
Yeah, I was going to say, I dare say
Ed Miliband's much
really
better at
enjoyed
this than when it was actually his job, potentially. Somebody's tweeting on the most important question of all. Charles says, what has Ed done to his hair? Some serious growth and shampoo body. His hair is looking very big and quite grey.
I think it suits him. It's dignified, isn't it? He looks very much. I mean, this isn't going to surprise people, but he looks increasingly like Ralph Miliband, his dad. Sorry,
Man looks like his own dad. Thank you for that, Patrick.
It sounds more profound when you talk about Ralph Miliband, doesn't it? Yeah.
Thank you for bringing us that sort of high level level of analysis. The thing that Ed Miliband's put his finger on, though, is an important one, and definitely is going to dominate some of COP next week. The decision to cut the amount of money that Britain spends on foreign aid from 0.7 to 0.5% of national income does make it harder when it comes to twisting the arms of other countries.
Yes, exactly. Especially when, so for instance, last week, the Times broke the news that Joe Biden was, understandably, if you put it in the context of that, it puts the UK in a sort of invidious diplomatic position, right? Because you have to go to, basically the UK strategy is to say to Joe Biden, right, developing countries are meant to, there's a shortfall in what developing countries are willing to spend. Can you sort of stick us a tenner in billions? And understandably, if you're dealing with a UK that has dialed back its own international aid commitments, then that's a diplomatic problem.
Yeah, and when he says that developing countries have to step up, it's slightly harder for them to do that if we're taking away the money from them that we previously promised them. Anyway, let's go. I think we're on question number 5 now. Ed Miliband.
Because it's one thing for him not to know what is in the Paris Agreement, but it's another for him not to know what's in his own budget. He has cut the aid budget. Of course he's cut the aid. Of course he's cut the aid budget. He's abandoned the bipartisan belief in the aid budget across both of these houses. But it's not just on aid, Mr. Speaker, where they face both ways. They've got a trade deal with Australia, where they've allowed them to drop their temperature commitments. They're telling others to power past coal while flirting with a new coal mine. And they're saying we've got to move beyond fossil fuels and opening the new Cambo oil field. Isn't the truth, Mr. Speaker, that the Prime Minister has undermined his own COP presidency by saying one thing and doing another?
Prime Minister.
No, Mr. Speaker. And he's completely wrong. He's completely wrong in what he's. And I think he should withdraw what he's just said about the 11.6 billion. Because we remain absolutely committed to the 11.6 billion pounds that we're investing to tackle climate change around the world, and that is absolutely rock solid. And he talks about Australia, and I talked to the Prime Minister of Australia only recently, and Australia has just with great difficulty made the commitment to get to net zero by 2050. It's a great thing. And Mr. Speaker, I talked yesterday to our Indonesian friends, for instance, Joko Widodo, a good friend of this country, who's agreed on coal to bring forward the abolition of coal use in Indonesia to 2040, Mr. Speaker. A fantastic effort by the Indonesians. I talked to President Putin, I think it was yesterday, Mr. Speaker, and he confirmed his determination to get to net zero by the middle of the century. And that is what the UK is doing, working with countries around the world to get the outcome we want. It's still too early to say whether it will succeed, Mr. Speaker. It's in the balance.
We've had that line a few times now. It's in the balance. I've just noted Boris Johnson's wearing a sort of COP26 badge.
It's quite fetching, I think.
I'm not totally sure if in the world of reducing waste and single-use plastics and all that, never giving everyone a badge and a mascot is necessary.
Tell you like that, Danny Finkelstein has a very big collection of political badges.
Does he?
He does.
I don't want to. I mean, these things are all relative, but that might be the most interesting thing I've heard in this half hour. I think let's go back. We'll have the last question from Ed Miliband.
The thing the Prime Minister has underestimated throughout these last 2 years is COP26 is not a glorified photo opportunity. It is a fragile and complex negotiation. And the problem is boosterism. The Prime Minister's boosterism won't cut carbon emissions in half. Photo opportunities won't cut carbon emissions in half. Can I just say to the Prime Minister, in these final days before COP26, we need more than warm words. Above all, Glasgow has got to be a summit of climate delivery, not climate delay.
Prime Minister.
He talks about cutting CO2 in half. Well, that's virtually what this government has done, Mr. Speaker. Since 1990, we've cut CO2 by 44%, and the economy's grown by 78%. And that's our approach, Mr. Speaker. A sensible, pragmatic, conservative approach that cuts CO2, that tackles climate change, and that delivers high-wage, high-skilled jobs across this country. And our net zero plan, Mr. Speaker, will deliver 440,000 jobs. That's what the people of this country want to see, and that's what they're seeing. They're seeing wages up, they're seeing growth up, they're seeing productivity up under this government. And if we left it to the right honourable gentleman, the Leader of the Opposition, who is sadly not in his place, we would still be in lockdown. But it's a point that he might bring to his attention wherever he is currently self-isolated.
We end with one of the greatest hits.
Yeah, I thought we were going to endure an entire session of PMQs without a jibe, one of the classic toolkit of jibes against Keir Starmer. But even though he's not in the room, Boris Johnson has managed
if it was up to him, we'd still be in
unleash that slam
lockdown.
dunk.
I mean, interesting. I mean, Ed Miliband was on his sort of home turf. He knows about this stuff. Former Energy and Climate Change Secretary. Shadow business is, shadowing much of what the government is now doing on this.
And he's the shadow Alex Sharma as well.
The shadow Alex Sharma. If that's not a job title that anybody wants, I don't know what is. But actually, he's done quite a good job of just putting up in lights again that it's quite a big deal, cop.
Yeah, he has. And also, it's that accusation he made in his penultimate question, delivery versus the government's actual actions on the environment, right? In the week where Tory MPs' inboxes have been full of people complaining about sewage in rivers, it's a really that accusation of double standards is really damaging for Tory MPs in particular, and it's one they're acutely aware of.
If you just tuned in and wondered what on earth was going on, you'd accidentally tuned into 2014. Keir Starmer tested positive for COVID-19 this morning, so he was not available for PMQs. Angela Rayner, the Deputy Leader of the Labour Party, is on bereavement leave, so Ed Miliband got a run out for the first time since 2015. And focused on climate change a lot. And Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor, will respond to the budget later on. Normally it's the Leader of the Opposition. We had William Hague giving advice to leaders of the opposition about what to do in the budget.
The one he left unspoken was do not catch a serious respiratory illness.
Do not get pinged.